Get full episodes of The Damage Report as a podcast on iTunes and Android, and you can watch the live show every weekday on YouTube TV. Last week on an episode of The Damage Report, we talked about a very interesting study profiled in the Washington Post having to do with men who are uncertain in their masculinity and support for Donald Trump. So I'm very excited now to welcome to The Damage Report Eric Knowles, social psychologist at NYU, lead researcher on that study. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Very glad to have you here. So for those who might not have seen our first video on the topic, what sort of study were you doing? What were you looking into?
Well, we were looking into a phenomenon that we call fragile masculinity, which is when men feel anxious that they aren't living up to whatever prevailing ideals or standards of manhood they have in their environment. So meeting these standards will often involve proving your strength and virility, being dominant and tough, and really importantly, avoiding even the hint of femininity. And we were really interested in whether this has political ramifications in the current moment.
So how did you look into that? And what were your findings when it comes to support for an example of a man who at least asserts to be very high in all these different measures when it comes to being a real man, Donald Trump?
Right. So the way we measured this, because we didn't think we could just straightforwardly poll men about their insecurities. So we used a publicly accessible tool called Google Trends that allows you to compare the popularity of different Google search terms in different regions of the country. And based on our sort of theorizing, we thought searches for topics like erectile dysfunction or hair loss or testosterone or Viagra might tend to be more popular in areas where men are experiencing a sense of fragile masculinity. And what we did was we used search volumes in different areas for these terms to predict how well Donald Trump did and how well more recently Republican House candidates did in actual elections in those areas.
And I want to make sure that people understand. So what you found, you did control. You looked at other elections. That this was not. I mean, you found obviously greater support for Donald Trump, but this wasn't just a Republican thing, right, or just a conservative thing.
No, and we didn't really know what to expect in that sense. What we found was that if you look back retrospectively and try to predict how well Mitt Romney did, how well John McCain did before that, using these search terms, you don't see any effect. But when it comes to Trump, we see a really robust correlation between the popularity of these search terms in a region and how well Donald Trump did in that region. And importantly, we're able to control or adjust for other factors like the average age of the men in that region, or the ethnic makeup of men in the region, or the rates of college education in the region. So we controlled for a lot of other factors to try to isolate what we think is a really interesting effect.
Okay, so very interesting study. I would like to learn more about fragile masculinity. For those in our audience, I'd like them to learn as well. So I am curious, in other work around this topic, we know now, apparently it can predict some support, or at least there's evidence that it can predict some support for Donald Trump. Are men who are feeling this, are they more likely to support certain types of government policies or hold certain political or ideological values?
Well, there's some great research in other labs. Like there's a sociologist, Rob Willer at Stanford, who's taken an experimental approach to this and actually exposed men to masculinity threats, and found that when men in his studies are exposed to masculinity threats, they will embrace kind of more bellicose foreign policy attitudes. He found when the study was run, for instance, that it increased support for the Gulf War. It seems across a lot of studies, both experiments and survey type studies, to lead fragile masculinity to lead to embracing more sort of right-wing, more kind of authoritarian policy attitudes and sort of foreign policy of a kind of dominant nature.
Okay, I can certainly understand the connection there. Do we, at this point, do you know, are some men just fragile in their masculinity and others aren't? It's sort of a free-flowing, random thing, or do we have some idea of what can cause certain men or groups of men to begin to feel this way?
I mean, that's a really great question. I don't think it's just a random thing. I think that I think when you get down to it, it's cultural. That some men are exposed to really stringent and almost unattainable ideals of what it means to be a man. And it's almost inevitable that men who exist in that kind of cultural setting are going to be more likely to feel insecure about how well they're doing because the standards are so high and so inflexible. And I want to be really clear that I don't think that men in areas of the country where these searches are popular are intrinsically any different from any men anywhere else. They're just normal men who are sort of contending with these really unattainable ideals of manhood. And just really quick, one thing we did find to your question is that in areas with very high unemployment rates, you see popularity of these fragile masculinity search terms are higher. So we think that's one way in which it's not just as you say, the random flow. It's men who are trying to get by in areas where they've suffered job losses, closure of their sort of traditional industries that they work in, manufacturing, mining.
Okay.
It's probably not a coincidence that this sense of insecurity is highest in those areas.
Okay, and potentially suggesting for some politicians who might want to fight back against this, some measures they could take. I have one more quick question for you. I apologize if this seems like an aside, but I spend a lot of time on the internet, and so I'm just curious. I have noticed that one of the big insults coming from right-wingers over the past few years has been cuck. It's become a thing that's very common. In your work, is there any reason to believe that this might be an expression less of them identifying less masculine men than them feeling less masculine themselves?
That people who use that epithet are feeling less masculine
Perhaps.
themselves? I think there's a connection. Obviously, that comes out of the sort of more racially tinged right wing. But I've been called that very word since the article came out more than once, and a lot of other things for that matter.
Yeah.
But I absolutely think that it's of a piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, and thank you for being willing to do this sort of research, knowing that it is an online minefield that you're entering into. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Eric Knowles, social psychologist at New York University. Thank you again. Thank you very much for watching this clip from the Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.